In 1958, France seemed to be on the verge of civil war. The settlers of Algeria, fearing a sellout by the politicians in Paris, were preparing to take the law into their own hands. The French army, it was thought, was ready to support them. Successive French governments had collapsed in the face of violence in the streets. Enfeebled at home and ridiculed abroad, France looked for a savior. One man had long waited for this moment. General Charles de Gaulle had saved France once, when all freedom-loving Frenchmen had rallied to his cross of Lorraine in the struggle against Hitler. He was ready to serve his country again. Given the power, he would save France from herself. In 1958, de Gaulle was living in retirement at colombey, les deux églises, a small country town some 100 miles from Paris. At 67, as he looked back on his life, he saw one star guiding his destiny, his love of France. Even as a child visiting Paris, he'd been moved, he wrote, by the symbols of our glories, night falling over Notre Dame, the majesty of evening at Versailles, the Arc de Triomphe in the sun, conquered color shuddering in the vault of les invalides. De Gaulle's lofty ideal of France sounded like fascism to those who rejected the appeal for order. A close observer of de Gaulle at this time was Middleton of the New York Times.
I don't believe the appeal for order was fascism at all. I think what he wanted was not an authoritarian government, but a stable government. A government that would give France the chance to expand her industry, to settle her foreign policy, and to get on into the 20th century. But above all, stability. Now, in phrasing what he had to say, he was expressing really his love for France as he saw her progressing in a stable, tranquil environment, not entirely his own love for power.
During de Gaulle's years of retirement, France's position in the world slumped. A long war in Indochina against the communist-inspired Viet Minh drained their resources. French parachutists fought bravely, but the war ended disastrously for them.
I believe he saw the Indochina fiasco as a signal example of the ineffectuality of the governments in Paris. He was quite right in his view that the war was lost not in the jungles of Indochina, but in Paris. And he felt that if he had been the leader of France, matters would have been handled quite differently. Certainly, much more efficiently, much more effectively.
French generals in Indochina felt badly let down by their allies and by their own governments in Paris. The war had cost the lives of 92,000 Frenchmen, all to no purpose. It was the parachutists in the French army who were especially embittered. They spearheaded the abortive Anglo-French attempt to seize the Suez Canal in 1956, and they had to bear the brunt of a long and savage fight against Algerian nationalists. Any talk of making terms with the nationalists produced riots in Algiers. The settlers were citizens of France, fully represented in the National Assembly. There was no solution which would satisfy all parties. Rioting spread to Paris. The cry of Algerie Française, French Algeria, was taken up on the streets and sounded out on car horns. No combination of parties survived long in government, and no politician could feel certain of the loyalty of the army. In the confusion, different groups for different reasons turned to the old warrior at Colombey. In a famous press conference, DeGaulle declared that he was available to serve France once again.
Crise succédait aux crises, indéfiniment les mêmes représentants des mêmes partis se répartir, se mélanger dans les mêmes postes ministériels sans qu'il en soit.
He belonged to no party, he said, and therefore he belonged to everybody. Now, he concluded, I shall return to my village and remain there at the disposal of my country. DeGaulle insisted that he must be legally invested with special powers and be given a definite term in which to work for order. He had no intention of seizing power. It must be entrusted to him with the full authority of the state. President Cody strongly supported him, and DeGaulle had his way. Men of the right saw DeGaulle as their champion. The army would certainly obey him. Men of the left feared a new kind of dictatorship. DeGaulle proposed a thoroughgoing reform of the Constitution, designed to give France a strong executive. To the accusation that he was planning to become a dictator, he replied, "Is it credible that I am going to begin a career as a dictator at the age of 67? Submitting his proposals to a national referendum, he campaigned vigorously to win the people's support. France gave him an overwhelming yes. DeGaulle's reforms gave France a presidential system of government and destroyed the old regime of parties, which he felt had fatally weakened the Fourth Republic as it had done the third before it. DeGaulle's France was the Fifth Republic, and he was its first president. The deep root of action by the best and strongest of men, he once wrote, is the desire to acquire power. In 1946, he had retired because he had no wish to be a mere figurehead of a president. Now he had achieved the position to which he had long aspired. He presided with real powers over a powerful state. He was France. His immediate task was to settle with Algeria, still seething with trouble. The French colonists, known as pieds noirs, had looked to him as their savior and felt betrayed. But DeGaulle had made them no promises. He understood the bitterness of the parachute generals, but his towering personality secured their obedience. A small secret army tried to wreck his plans and made several attempts on his life. But DeGaulle carried on in what he judged was in the best long-term interests of France.
A leader must make a choice. He was wise enough to see the conditions could not continue as they were. And when he made the choice, I think it's reasonable to assume that the choice was made in favor of his longtime mistress, of France, of metropolitan France. Although he didn't admit it, I think he saw what Harold Macmillan called the winds of change. And then again, there may be something in that certain contempt he had for Frenchmen, especially for pieds noirs. They hadn't backed him in the war. They shouted hurrah for Pérouton, they shouted hurrah for Giraud. I don't think he felt he owed them anything.
Under DeGaulle, France again found a voice in world affairs. When the leaders of the West met in Paris, it was like a club of old friends. Eisenhower, his wartime colleague, was President of the United States. Britain's Harold Macmillan had been with DeGaulle in Algiers. With Konrad Adenauer of Germany, DeGaulle had a special relationship. His friends, however, found DeGaulle a troublesome member of their club. The role he sought for France in the world meant excluding the influence of powerful rivals. Especially was this the case in Europe, where DeGaulle twice blocked Britain's application to join the common market. Power, among other things, provides those who wield it with the opportunity to repay old scores. DeGaulle had never forgotten nor forgiven the slights, real or fancied, of Britain and the United States during the war. Whether or not these memories influenced him, his actions were at the expense of the Anglo-Saxons.
Avec sympathie de ce que paraît indiquer à ce sujet, de ce que paraissent indiquer à ce sujet.
Instead, DeGaulle looked for a self-reliant Europe led by France, a Europe in which each nation retained its sovereignty and freedom of action. In this Europe, a rearmed West Germany must take her rightful place. The friendship of DeGaulle and Adenauer sprang from the shattering experiences their two countries had suffered in war. DeGaulle helped end the feud, which had so bedeviled European history for the past 100 years. DeGaulle used power with supreme confidence. Believing France should stand in her own strength, he withdrew her forces from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The credibility of Western defense as a whole was seriously weakened, but DeGaulle could boast of his own nuclear armory, which France was building up. The cost was enormous, but DeGaulle insisted, despite his critics, that France must be able to defend herself against an attack from any direction. In foreign affairs, de Gaulle's initiatives served France less well. It seemed he could only meddle when he was away from home.
He went to Latin America, made a number of speeches about how France would help Mexico, for example. Far beyond France's capability at the time of aiding Mexico. He just didn't have the money or the machinery or the technicians. But he made the offer. It satisfied him, let's say.
Señor Presidente, Mexicanos, traigo a México el saludo de Francia. Francia saluda México con amistad.
When he came to Canada, the chance of meddling in other people's troubles proved too strong.
Je puis vous dire qu'elle en vaudra mieux. Vive Montréal, vive le Québec. Vive le Québec libre.
He knew by doing that he would irritate first the English Canadians, secondly the British, no matter how tenuous their ties with Canada were at the time, and thirdly, of course, the Americans, who weren't particularly excited about Quebec at the time, but didn't want a foreign leader coming in, not because they were all that worried about DeGaulle, but suppose somebody else came in.
Well past the age when most men retire, Charles de Gaulle had reached the summit of power. He was president of France, with a constitution tailored to his liking. He was supported by a slavish majority of Gaullist deputies in the National Assembly, and served by an able civil service dependent on him for jobs. He held court like a Republican monarch, a Washington untrammeled by Congress.
I think by then, his ego had reached the point where he thought almost anything was possible. I don't believe he ever really understood the way democratic governments work. He was so disillusioned by the way the Third Republic and the Fourth Republic worked that he could not believe that, say, the American Congress or the British Parliament could come up with well-conceived schemes. At the same time, of course, he grew more and more aloof, more and more solitary, and was not interested so much in misleading people as ignoring them.
De Gaulle also had style. His commanding figure could not fail to impress visitors. Conscious of the dignity of his office, de Gaulle welcomed them to France as though Paris was the center of the world. Critics said that he would be a better informed president and France better governed if he had to stand before a parliament or a Congress and answer questions twice a week. But none of his fellow statesmen could touch him for sheer presence. That force of character which had brought him through the dark days of the war. De Gaulle could afford to unbend with one old wartime comrade. In the long twilight of his life, Winston Churchill came to Paris to be received by the man who had given him so many headaches in the past. Many years had gone by since they had taken the victory salute together in Paris. Both of them knew what it meant to lose power just when it seemed assured, and then regain it later. De Gaulle's Fifth Republic transformed France. He gave her a political stability which she had not known for half a century. Under his rule, the currency was reformed, industry revived, the economy expanded. The settlement of Algeria relieved the country of a political abscess. Party strife was muted. All this confirmed de Gaulle's confident assertion of personal power in the crisis of 1958. He sought no monument for himself, but only for France. But 10 years of one-man rule proved irksome to many Frenchmen, especially the young. In 1968, student demonstrations against the Gaullist system coincided with a widespread workers' strike. Unrest spread throughout France, and for a time, de Gaulle seemed isolated.
But I also think that he had an innate arrogance in any case. It's not a question of suffering fools gladly. He just didn't suffer anybody that wasn't pertinent to his purpose at the time. He could be perfectly charming with reporters when the point was to get over some idea of Gaullist policy. The overriding feeling, I think he felt as he grew older, is I've been right so often and they've been wrong. Look what I've accomplished and look what the mob has wanted. So that, in fact, I believe he felt that as far as his daily governing of France was concerned, the less he saw the mob, the better. And the mob, including, I suppose, the National Assembly.
De Gaulle at first tried the techniques he had used before to secure acceptance of the Constitution of the Fifth Republic. But these appeals failed to still the uproar. 1968 was a year of student trouble in other countries. The activists in this movement knew the power of television coverage upon a mass of uncritical viewers. Although de Gaulle's government controlled France's broadcasting networks, it could not suppress all news of what was happening in the streets of Paris and other major French cities. De Gaulle met the crisis with characteristic defiance. "I shall not retire," he declared. "I have a mandate from the people. I shall fulfill it." Having assured himself that the army remained loyal, he dissolved the assembly and campaigned with all his old vigor in the elections. The choice, he said, was between himself and the communists. The result was an overwhelming victory for the Gaullists. Yet something had changed. Though de Gaulle's system might survive to keep the communists out of power in future elections, it was clear that de Gaulle's personal style of government could not long continue. He resigned a year later, and soon after he died, bequeathing to his country an idea of France which would live on in the hearts of all who loved her.
Well, he failed, I think, in the end because he had the weaknesses of his strength. He was arrogant, he was aloof. As he grew older, he could not understand the new working class, the post-war working class in France, and certainly not the students. And to them, he was something out of a remote past. Some of his great deeds had been done before they were born. But this man had great qualities. He was brave. He would have given his life for France at any given moment and thought the gift well given. He believed in virtues which are now somewhat out of fashion: patriotism, duty, honor. He was a great Frenchman, I suppose the greatest since Napoleon.